George Wallace was a politician from the state of Alabama, and basically what he wanted was for the state of Alabama to be, a proud state, in which people from Alabama felt like they could go anywhere in the country and take pride in being Alabaman. And for the people in the north and stuff to not look down on them and stuff, and for them to be better educated and for them to have better infrastructure and like hospitals and everything. And so that's basically what he wanted. However, the problem with George Wallace is that he was a populist, right? So the problem with being a populist is this. As much as you might want to do good things for the people, you kind of end up making a bit of a Faustian pact, So you end up making, as it were, a deal with the devil, in the sense where your own principles and your own values end up being sacrificed just because of the will of the people. And obviously the will of the people can change. Sometimes people are right, people are people, right? So sometimes people are good, sometimes people are bad, and it's about making good arguments, and stand on principle and trying to convince the electorate rather than just going along with it and just saying me too. So George Wallace, he was originally not in favour of like segregation really, and he wasn't like, from everything I've kind of seen of him, I can't see him being a full-on by today's standard, he would be a racist, but like by the standard of the day, he was relatively moderate on the issue of racism. However, something to note about the politics of the Deep South in those days was this. Like, for you to be elected to any kind of public office, you had to be a Democrat, right? And, you also had to be in favour of segregation. We covered this in previous videos, such as like, what if Dewey had won in 1948, where we talk about like the Southern like Dixiecrats and stuff. And, we discussed it in previous videos as well, because it's a situation where the Democratic Party in those days in the South was the party of white supremacy. It was the party of segregation. And so it was a thing where, they excluded many people from voting. So they had poll tax and they made it very, very difficult for black and for poor whites to be able to vote. And so as a result, you end up getting like election results where it's like 80%, 90%, 95% or whatever voting for the Democratic Party in these states. So the real election, the real kind of contest, that candidates had to really put themselves through wasn't actually at the election time. It was at the primary process, for picking who would be the candidate for the Democratic Party. And so in 1958, George Wallace was running against someone called Patterson, and Patterson was actually endorsed explicitly by the Ku Klux Klan. And Wallace in those days was actually supported by the NAACPs. So this is the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. Kind of confused as to why they still have that name, but whatever. I think it's probably just the historical legacy of it. They don't want to change it. But anyway, so it was supported by the NAACP. So this kind of gives you an idea in terms of the wider context of what comes later. That was where George Wallace started his political career. However, he ended up losing that nomination to Patterson. So Patterson got 56% and Wallace got 44%. And it was at this point when Wallace famously said to his campaign staff, he basically said that, this man, Patterson, he so-called out N-word me, right? I'm never going to allow anyone to out N-word me again. So that was basically his way of saying that on the racial issue, he would never be outdone again by someone. So whatever the rhetoric of the person was, he was always going to go more extreme than that in order to kind of have that vote really solidly down. And so that was something which he kind of bore in mind. And when he ran in 1962, he stood on that platform and he got elected, this time by 56% to 44%. So he completely flipped what the results had been before just by taking this out. So everything else has stayed exactly the same about George Wallace. The only issue was the racial issue, and this gave him a 12-point swing, and ended up making him the governor. And when he became governor, he stood on the same platform that Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy, had stood on, like over 100 years before. And he famously said the lines of, "I throw down the gauntlet at the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." And this was met with thunderous applause. So this kind of gives an idea of just how much support the man had. And that speech was actually written by a Ku Klux Klan speechwriter who was called Asa Carter. And Asa Carter actually ran against him in the 1970 gubernatorial election and stuff, So I'm quite surprised I said that word, gubernatorial, basically when you're electing someone to be the governor of the state. But anyway, so that kind of gives an idea of just how much he's shifted. Yeah, he's gone from, being like endorsed by the NAACP to literally having your speech written by someone who's in the KKK. And during his time as governor, he was really, really hard when it came to this segregation issue. Yeah, so much so that when they tried to desegregate the University of Alabama, he famously stood in the doorway of there and refused to let the two black students come to that university. And it took for the president to literally, basically federalize the state guard. Yeah, so obviously each like state in America has its own like national guard. So it took for President Kennedy to literally send in the troops and basically kind of say, right, we're going to take over the Alabama State Guard and order you, George Wallace, to move out the way. It literally took for that, which could have started a civil war. Actually, could do a future video on that if anyone's interested. Yeah. So actually, in that first year of him being the governor, he said that in the next year's presidential election, like he would run and oppose JFK for the Democratic nomination. And so obviously Kennedy was assassinated later that year, and LBJ ended up taking over him. So you'd expect, obviously, the president's just been killed. Johnson's obviously taken it over as like his vice president and stuff. You'd expect there to be a kind of good feelings and stuff, and just for people just to like let it slide. No, George Wallace, because this issue of like segregation was such a live button issue for people in the South, it was a thing where he said, no, I'm still gonna run. So so in the Democratic convention that year, like they obviously people dropped out and stuff, and Johnson in the end it didn't end up going all the way to like the full thing, but it was a thing where at the point at which people started to like drop out and stuff, it was a thing where Johnson had roughly about 18% of the vote, and Wallace had about 11% of the vote. So even in the context of all of this, it was still a thing where a lot of people in the Democratic Party were still in favour of people like George Wallace who were in favour of segregation. So the Democratic Party in these years were really, really split still. Right, so now we're going to talk about the 1968 presidential election. We're not going to go into the alternative history part just yet. We're going to like do that a little bit later into the video. But for now, we're just going to talk broadly about like Wallace's campaign in 1968. So in 1968, he didn't end up running for the Democratic nomination. Instead, he went and formed his own party, which is called the American Independent Party. And this was basically a party, the issue of segregation had shifted now to being like kind of anti-busing. So busing was the policy of taking black students from the inner cities and stuff, right? And driving them out to white neighborhoods and taking them to like what had been like white schools in order to promote like racial harmony and like racial mixing and stuff. However, this was opposed by many, many people. It's a very hot button issue, so much so that like even Richard Nixon ended up like taking on like this mantle, because like, this was a very, very unpopular thing for many people, and so like politicians could very cleverly kind of say, oh no, it's not about racism and stuff yet. It's about you as a parent having a say in what school your child goes to. So it's dressed in this kind of like dog whistle language, where it's like, oh, it's all about like school choice and stuff, right? When actually it had nothing to do with that. It was a racist like thing, but just people, without overtly saying it, people knew what you meant when you said like opposition to busing in those respects. So Wallace obviously ran against that, but also, he had some other policies as well, like, he wanted to famously, like if they weren't able to win the war in Vietnam within 90 days, he wanted to pull troops out. He famously said that he wanted to like end like foreign aid and stuff, and military aid to like America's allies. So he said, the countries in Europe and like in Asia and stuff, they need to take care of their own like defense and stuff instead of always like relying on America. There's a lot of parallels between this man and someone else more recently. Also as well, this person at rallies and stuff was very, very rude to people. Like he took a very much of a strong stance when it came to like protesting and stuff. And there's a lot of echoes between this person and someone else who was president more recently, if you get what I'm saying. But anyway, not comparing the two exactly, but there's a lot of overlap with the two people and their campaigns. But when it came to him picking who would be his vice presidential and his running mate, because he'd taken such a strong stance before, it was quite difficult to get people to want to run on the same ticket as him. So originally he had wanted people like John Wayne, who turned him down. He wanted FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to run. He turned him down. He even wanted, get this, he wanted Colonel Sanders, the Colonel Sanders, of KFC. He wanted him to be his running mate. He turned him down. So the only person he ended up being left with was General Curtis LeMay. And so this person was in like the Air Force and stuff, and he was like very famous within like some of the earlier wars that America was in. However, Curtis LeMay must have been like asleep under a rock or something, because this man had clearly forgotten the lessons of 1964. So in 1964, Johnson won that campaign largely through the help of a political attack ad, which is famously known as a daisy. So it's basically a little girl picking a daisy, and then there's a countdown like 10, 9, 8, and then there ends up being a nuclear explosion at the end of that countdown and stuff. And this is basically to discredit the Goldwater campaign and basically say that if you elect Goldwater, you won't have in World War III. So Curtis LeMay must have completely missed the memo on that, because he said like, oh, if we get elected, we're just going to nuke North Vietnam, which would have obviously led towards World War III, and it ended up really damaging Wallace's campaign's chances in that time. So much so that like Hubert Humphrey, who was running for the Democrat Party, like kind of at that time, he famously labelled Wallace and LeMay as being the so-called Bomsey twins, right? So it really hurt his chances, but that's just something to kind of bear in mind, that he probably should not have picked this guy. Anyway, he ended up losing that election, obviously, and then, the next time he ran was in 1972. But before we look at what he would have been like as president, let's first look at what he was like as governor. So George Wallace, he was a very innovative governor. He was in favour of like low taxes and stuff, but also for having like welfare policies like that to help like the ordinary people of Alabama. He was very much in favour of infrastructure, so building roads and highways and stuff, and also for building hospitals, building a lot of schools, both like elementary school, high schools, community colleges, and actually a lot of like universities and stuff. So he was really instrumental in modernizing like Alabama and stuff, and trying to like get so that people would want to actually invest in it. And also one of the things that he started doing, which was like way ahead of his time, and a lot of other governors end up copying him from doing this, and this would basically be to go to a northern businessman in like places like New York, etc. And what he would say is that if you come to my state, we will have like low taxes for you. We'll have everything all set up and stuff. So you set up your factories here, you set up your offices here and stuff. So you're bringing jobs to our state. And like the benefit of it is obviously you have a cheaper like workforce. It's less unionized as well. It's one of those right to work states. So like kind of it's not as much of a closed shop as it is in many kind of unionized northern states. And then also that obviously brings jobs. That's going to help the people of Alabama. So this is one of the things that he did, and like I said, like lots of other states end up copying him. So really ahead of the time in that regard. However, something to note is that the Constitution of the state of Alabama, up until that point, restricted people to having like single terms. So you could run again 4 years afterwards, but you couldn't have consecutive terms. So you couldn't be the governor, for instance, for 8 years in a row. So like this meant that when he became the governor in 1963, it meant that, 1967, he had to stop being governor. So this is something which also kind of hurt his chances when it came to run for the president, because former governor doesn't sound as good as being the governor of Alabama, right? For when you're running to be the president. So he did try and get these rules changed. However, many people in the state legislature in Alabama did not allow this to happen, because they saw it as just being a naked power grab. Now, in the long run, like in the next few years even, Wallace's supporters end up getting it so that this rule ended up being changed. So he ended up having to like step out of politics for a bit. Then he got his wife to run in his place. However, his wife had cancer, she ended up dying, and so he ended up then taking over afterwards, right? So in 1970, he became the governor again. And the campaign that he ran there, the reason I'm telling this story is just to give you an idea of what he would have been like as president. So in 1970, he ran on a really, really racist platform, right? So just to give you an idea of like the adverts that he was running, in these adverts, it would clearly say that, do you want the black bloc to vote for the governor and stuff, right? So it basically, because obviously African Americans at this point now could finally vote for like who they wanted to represent them and stuff. And so the fear was for many white voters in Alabama was that you know, like if all the black people voted and stuff a certain way, they might end up being the ones like picking who the next governor would be. So Wallace basically played on the fear of that in order to get elected in that campaign. And another advert that he ran was basically, a white girl surrounded by 7 black guys, and the slogan ran as "Wake up, Alabama! Blacks vow to take over Alabama." So this was clear race baiting, yeah. So not to say he would have necessarily done this on a national level, but it gives you a bit of a clue in terms of these were the levels to which he was willing to stoop at this point to just to get that kind of racist vote and stuff, right? So now it was the 1972 presidential election, and he was actually the governor now rather than being the former governor. And so as a result, he ended up being very high in the polls, yeah. And because he ran for the Democratic Party again rather than for the American Independent Party, he now had a lot of support within the thing. So he ended up actually being joint first place, yeah, in the polls in May of 1971 for that position, yeah. So George McGovern ended up winning it in the end, but so he was neck and neck with George McGovern. However, in May of 1971, that's when he had his infamous assassination attempt, right? So this is when someone in the crowd came up to him and shot him several times, and this had him crippled for life, yeah. So he was in a wheelchair. He lost all kind of bodily functions below the waist, and he was in an immense amount of pain throughout the rest of his life. And this really hurt his chances and stuff, yeah. But something to note with this story is that as divisive as he was, as as unpopular as he was, as hated as he was by many, it was still a thing where his political opponents were able to put that to the side for one moment and actually show him some care and compassion. So he had the following people actually come to his hospital bedside, yeah. So he had Richard Nixon, he had George McGovern, he had Hubert Humphrey, and he had Ted Kennedy, that come to visit him. So these were people who he'd run against and was running against, and yet they still were able to take the time out to visit him in hospital. And also he received a telegram to his hospital bed from former President Johnson, from at that point Governor Reagan. So he would obviously later become President Reagan, but at that point he was just the governor of California. And he also even got a telegram from the Pope himself, wishing his condolences. So it's a thing where I just wanted to put a little story in just to show how much the political climate has changed in terms of people, you can still show your humanity even when your opponents are not really showing any of their kind of humanity in that regard. So that's just something to kind of bear in mind for how we view the modern world and stuff and politics at the current time. But this immense amount of pain that he ended up being put through and stuff, made him over time come to realize, what pain he inflicted on the people of Alabama and done on other people in the country, in particular many of people from the African American community. And I don't know how true this is, but certainly in the film George Wallace, there's a clip where he ends up going to the old church of Martin Luther King and speaks to the congregation there and basically makes peace with them. Basically says, "I'm really sorry for what I had done." There was a later point in his life he ended up speaking to the 2 former students who he stood in the doorway for and made peace with them. And in the late 70s he became a born again Christian and really apologized for all the immense amount of pain that he'd kind of caused people. And there's an element to which a cynical person could say, he only did that just to get elected, because he was running in 1982 a gubernatorial thing. And there's an element to which, because obviously the times changed, and this is the thing to note with George Wallace, just to see how much real kind of populist he was. The rhetoric which he said in the early 60s was not the same rhetoric which he was saying in 1982 when he got elected again, because the political climate had changed in Alabama. The country had changed in that time as well. And so what he even what he could say in the early 70s, compared to what you could say in the late 70s, society had changed. And as a populist, he moved at the same pace as the majority of people in his state. So as the majority of people in the state moved away from having those kind of entrenched hardline views on race, so too he kind of shifted his rhetoric. So you could say as a very, in a cynical way, you could say, oh, he just did this just to get votes and stuff. And actually in 1982 when he ended up running again, he ended up getting quite a large percentage of the black vote in Alabama, and actually without black people supporting him, it's very unlikely that he would have actually won that gubernatorial thing, because like the politics of the South was shifting. Yeah, the Democratic Party was now more and more the party of like Northern liberals, and the Republican Party was becoming the party of like Southern conservatives. And so, just to illustrate this point further, George Wallace said that he wouldn't run again in 1986, and so the Democratic candidate in 1986 end up losing, right? And the person he ended up winning against, yeah, this Republican represented the first time in 114 years that the state of Alabama had voted for a Republican governor, right? So since the era of Reconstruction, it always been a Democratic governor. So this kind of shows like the change in winds, yeah, within America. And since 1986, like with only a few years of like exception, it's always been the rule where the Republicans are the ones in charge of the state of Alabama now. So it kind of just gives you an idea of like just how much like things change in America over time and stuff.